Hi everyone, my name's Steve Barrett. I'm the Director of Sports Science and Research Innovation for Playmaker. And today I'm joined by Jack Hickey and Selwyn Griffith to discuss accelerated hamstring return to play and training. So just to start off with, I've asked both of the guys to just do a brief introduction. So Jack, if you want to lead us off, please, with an introduction and background about yourself, please.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Steve. So I suppose my background is in exercise science and clinical exercise physiology. So I practiced for a few years clinically in musculoskeletal and sports injury rehabilitation before coming back to the university system to take on a PhD. And that was with the ACU Hamstring Injury Research Group. So I sort of applied those clinical skills to research. Tried to meld the two together, and that was sort of the main area of my PhD research was accelerated rehabilitation strategies for hamstring injury rehabilitation. And since that time, which was a couple of years ago now, since submitting the PhD, I've remained at ACU as an academic staff member, but still fortunate enough to practice clinically and do some consulting, primarily in sports injury rehabilitation. And my teaching and research is mainly around sports injuries, with obviously hamstring injury being a key focus of that.
Cool, thank you. And to you, Selwyn?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to be on the Playmaker webinar the other week, and I work as a performance coach for the Brisbane Lions Football Club. My background is as an osteopath by trade, but I've been working within the strength and conditioning and rehabilitation program at the Lions for the last 3 to 4 years, but I've been at the club for about 8 years now.
Cool. Thank you, guys. And again, thank you for the great talk at the Performance Multidisciplinary Teams webinar. It seems to go down very well. And on the back of that, we've got quite a few questions, which we've merged together with some of the other questions commonly asked for you guys to kind of give the audience a bit of an overview of what background is and hopefully answer those questions that have been unanswered. So to kick start us off, first question is, looking at the clinical examination seems to be an important component of hamstring RTP. Can you elaborate on what the current best practice is for clinical assessment and how may it assist in planning rehab progressions?
I reckon Jack's pretty well placed for discussing this part with his PhD.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to kick it off. I mean, I think probably one thing to always keep in mind is what's the purpose of your clinical assessment. And so I suppose for me, personally, being an exercise physiologist, clinical assessment is used to guide my exercise prescription. It's not used for diagnostic purposes. So where a physio or a sports doc would be performing an initial clinical assessment to diagnose and categorize an injury in terms of its location and severity, the purpose for me as an exercise professional is to perform an assessment that's going to really inform what I do from an exercise prescription point of view, but not only at that initial time point, but to continually perform those assessments throughout the rehabilitation process to either guide progression of exercise or running progressions and things like that, but probably more importantly, give prognostic outlook for your athletes. And informing them on perhaps where they're at as a general guide in terms of their recovery, because that's always the question that an athlete is going to have. They're probably less concerned even with the specific diagnosis, but they just want to know when they can go back to sport. So in my experience, that's where I found it most useful. In terms of, I suppose, what clinical assessments and what that looks like, there's probably a few key things that I tend to look at from a real general point of view. Especially early days, pain with walking. And so whether someone can walk or, get around without any limp or any discomfort during normal walking is a really good sign within the first few days that they're going to be ready to start introducing some low-level jogging and running and that sort of thing. And there is some research that suggests that is associated with longer-term return to sport if that pain with walking sticks around for more than a few days after the initial injury. In terms of your basic clinical assessments of flexibility and strength, I think if I had to pick one test for hamstring flexibility, the active knee extension test is really useful. So holding the thigh at 90 degrees of hip flexion and then extending the knee as far as we can, or some of the guys at Aspetar have looked at the maximal hip flexion active knee extension test. So basically pulling the thigh right up to the chest and then extending the knee. I think either one of those and looking at between limb deficits is really useful. There's some good solid data from Aspetar to suggest that correlates pretty well with return to play times and recovery. And as far as strength goes, it's looking at strength probably in those outer range positions. And again, that data from Aspetar and Rod Whiteley's group there, shows pretty strongly that those outer range positions being in a position of, again, hip flexion of about 90 degrees and knee flexion of 90 degrees. And we've got some data that also suggests that correlates pretty well with return to play time in terms of pain and also between limb differences. So they're the sorts of things at a basic level that I'd look at. But obviously throughout rehab, you're going to be guided by how they're progressing from an exercise point of view as well. But so I want to, be keen to hear your thoughts in terms of, with athletes and, what you tend to implement or find of most use.
Yeah, I think the research you highlighted has been pivotal in what we do at the Lions and the components of Rod Whiteley and some of the team at Aspetar around the impact of clinical examination on the decision-making process, and some of their research that actually showed that MRI classification and determination had minimal impact on actual return to play guidelines. So it's really interesting when you start to look at some of the literature out there around MRI classification and how it may have an impact on return to play timeframes, and it's actually really poorly correlated with return to play guidelines. So the clinical assessments that you highlighted, Jack, are some that we use at the Lions, and I think there are other components as well to just help to possibly clear some of those trickier hamstring cases, maybe the neural compromised hamstrings that on an MRI are classified as a grade 0 these days. So assessing possibly a slump test or a straight leg raise to see if there is some form of neural sensitization or central sensitization that may be driving the hamstring awareness. From a strength perspective, there's been a little bit of stuff done by Martin Woolen at the AIS looking at the prone hamstring isometric contractions around 15 to 30 degrees. So whether or not you're using that just as a palpation assessment with your physios, or whether you're actually using handheld dynamometry is probably dependent on what you have available. But those are kind of some of the early stage components. The active straight leg raise and the Askling test are an interesting one. They're probably one that we have shied away from within our environment. We've found that guys don't tend to perform them as well as we'd like, and are sometimes fearful in the early stages. So those tests that you highlighted around the passive knee extension and the full hip flexion knee extension, I think are really pivotal to help guide what we're able to do. We also do a simple scrape test where we'll get the athlete to just drag their heel along the ground, and it's almost a little bit of a test of how much awareness they have on an isometric contraction with kind of a component of shortening as well. So and palpation sometimes plays a role within those, especially with some of the more severe hamstring strains where you may be able to palpate some tendon thickness when we start to talk about the intramuscular tendon involvement. But outside of that, I think the clinical examination paints a great picture for exercise prescription, but also allowing to guide phase transition through the criterion-based approach.
Cheers, guys. Thank you. I think it was really interesting you both mentioned about like different personnel within your environments. How important is it, like that multidisciplinary team with regards to not just a clinical examination, but then looking at how to assess that rehab process throughout?
I think Selwyn's probably the best place there for, in a high performance environment.
Yeah, I think it's pivotal that you have a really collaborative approach with your medical and your performance staff. You want to make sure that you are not too conservative with your initial diagnosis, and that everyone is on the same page with how you're going to progress through your criterion-based approach. So making sure that everyone understands what the criteria are that you need to achieve to get into phase 1 or phase 2. And so making sure that your medical staff and your performance staff are on the same page, and and that you actually collaborate to build the plan out. And we have a really strong approach with that, but also our medical team are really great with trying to encourage guys that they'll actually, the more that they can do off the table, the better they'll be moving forwards. And we kind of use the philosophy of more today, better tomorrow. And so we really encourage them to move early, and that passive treatment actually is nowhere near as beneficial as active treatment. So if we can engage them in movement or in strength, in exercise, then we tend to have better time frames in our return to play. But we also tend to find that the athletes are slightly desensitized to the pain and don't start to fear the pain that they're experiencing from the injury.
And so, do you find that different personality types are actually reporting pain in different ways? Or what kind of impact do you reckon the personality of those individuals affects this kind of process as well?
Yeah, so I think I highlighted the disc profile in my talk the other week, and understanding everyone's personality profile to a degree. You may not need to know 100% how they are, but you need to understand what their response is to pain, and are they a pain catastrophizer, or have they been someone who's actually experienced pain before and able to adapt to that pain stimulus. And so how then you verbalize what's going on to them may actually have an impact for those guys who are pain catastrophizers. And they're the ones where you probably really need to break down the objective and subjective criteria that they need to achieve to get through each phase. Whereas someone who has possibly experienced injury before and possibly severe injury, their pain perception may be somewhat duller than some of those other athletes. So your ability to put objectives in front of them and them understand that some awareness is okay throughout the reconditioning process is slightly better than those other guys. And so being able to determine how much information you need to give certain people dependent on how their response is to pain is, I think, really important. And the language that you use around how the diagnosis and the prognosis of their injury is really powerful as well to get buy-in from the athlete into the process, especially if you are trying to be somewhat aggressive or accelerated, like with what some of Jack's research looked at with applying eccentric exercise as an early stimulus. If you don't have the guys understanding the benefit of that, then all of a sudden when you try and apply it and they have some pain perception with it, they may actually go into a fear avoidance pattern. And that's definitely something that we want to avoid in early stages of rehabilitation.
Thank you. And Jack, have you got any experiences from your line of work with regards to those different personality types as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think someone touched on it there. An individualized approach is, it's always going to be what we strive for. And, I mean, someone alluded to some of our research where, we looked at allowing pain or completely avoiding pain during rehabilitation, as it's often recommended. And I think one thing to keep in mind if you go and read some of that research is when you design a randomized control trial and you allocate to either that pain threshold or pain-free rehabilitation approach, there's going to be certain individuals allocated to either of those groups that might be better or not as suited to either of those interventions. And so I think the key thing is, and if I'm working with someone now, it's more about the education side of things and really explaining to them what pain actually may or may not mean. And so when we've got someone with an acute hamstring strain injury, low levels of pain during exercise don't necessarily mean tissue damage. And we know that it's completely safe to exercise with low levels of pain in a range of musculoskeletal pathologies, but we've been able to show that it's totally safe in the hamstring strain injury population. So reassuring them and explaining that to them is really important, but at the same time, understanding that there's probably a limit at some point. The challenge there is that putting a numerical limit, as we did in that study from a study design point of view, is really challenging, because what my 4 out of 10 pain is probably going to be very different to what Selwyn's 4 out of 10 pain is. And so our individual experiences will guide that. And providing an anchor point at either end of that scale is really, for me, the critical thing. So explaining that when we use a 0 to 10 numeric rating scale, that 0 means absolutely no pain and 10 is the worst pain imaginable for that individual. And again, that's an individualized number at that 10, but within the individual, at least we know we're getting a consistent response, or relatively consistent response. I mean, I certainly know that there was individuals in that particular study who were, for example, allocated to a pain-free rehab approach, and they very quickly learned that if in rehab they're telling me that they've got 1 out of 10 pain in terms of intensity, and I'm telling them, well, when you get 1 out of 10, I'm pulling you up because you're in that group. Well, they quickly learned that, I'm just going to say 0, because 0 means I can keep going. If there's someone who wants to push and work through pain, versus if I set the upper limit at 4 out of 10 or 5 out of 10, and you're a bit more conservative, as soon as you don't want to keep going, magically what that number comes out as is being 5 or 6 out of 10. So you see some interesting things with that. And I think the most important component is that education and identifying, is this someone I'm going to need to be a little bit more wary of in terms of how hard they want to push, particularly with things like high speed running where we might have less control over, altering the movement while it's actually happening, as opposed to a slow controlled eccentric where if they feel a bit of pain through that, it's probably not the end of the world because it's a very controlled movement. So really setting those expectations early days, with your athletes or your clients or patients is really important for mine.
I suppose that education side of things is really important, especially those that are like first-time offenders, so to speak, with a hamstring injury. Like you look at, I'm sure you've had guys with multiple hamstring injuries. Hopefully, there's not many of them, but they're the ones that you require less education potentially on what they perceive as pain because they've been there and done that.
Yeah, I think to an extent, but it can go both ways in my experience. You can have certain guys who they might be chronic rehabbers, and depending on the sort of rehab they've done in the past, that could greatly influence their expectations of what rehab actually is. For a lot of guys, particularly, a lot of guys that I might work with who are not necessarily elite athletes, but they're, maybe semi-professional to recreational level. Some of these guys might get a hamstring injury and literally rest for a week or two, and then they just start running again. And when they feel good, they get back out there. And so that's very different to an athlete that someone's going to be working with at the elite level. And, I've seen it from both ends of the spectrum where, you'll have those elite guys who are so in tune that you almost need to just calm them down a little bit with, how much they want to be doing, versus those who might come in and all of a sudden you're telling them just to do 2 days out of a week worth of exercise, and they're thinking that you're asking them to do too much. So it's past experience is important to kind of get on top of early, I think.
Yeah, and I think that the organisational culture within high performance sport plays a big role in possibly what that looks like. And if you have a culture that has been set on possibly restricting guys from doing exercise or running until they're completely pain-free versus getting guys moving within a comfortable range as early as possible, that'll have an impact on how your athletes will respond, because your management of the environmental emotion around injury and around pain is going to be different versus kind of environments that may be working against you because of their pain sensitization component from just the constant messaging of, you can't do anything until you're pain-free, or the constant restriction of doing exercises or movements dependent on what they feel pain with. So what the culture is within the organisation and who is responsible for that messaging will play a big impact on those guys that are fearful versus non-fearful as well. And we are really focused on trying to make sure that when some of our guys return back to running, that when they're actually doing possibly some of their controlled running for high speed, that we don't actually talk to them between reps, because like what Jack alluded to, you can sometimes have those highly sensitized guys who just every step they're trying to analyze what their technique was like, if they had discomfort depending on what speed, and they want to know to the 0.1 kilometre per hour or 0.1 metre per second of how quickly they were running. And we try and just encourage them to run as comfortably as they can with it under their pain tolerance of, we use 3 or 4 out of 10. So as long as we can get them moving or running with a dull sensation, and what we talk about is avoiding that pinpoint sharpness, that localized pinpoint sharpness. If they have some dull awareness when they're running, we're happy to continue to exercise them through that, because there's a component that's probably occurring that's a little bit of working on the neuromuscular patterning post the injury. So we're trying to allow some of that central sensitization to dull down, but also we're trying to avoid any constant communication on how did that feel? You look like you're running differently. How does that left step feel to your right step? And I just want you to raise your knee a bit higher to the sky. And so we try and avoid that where possible. And if we do think that we need to change a guy's technique or do need to adjust how a guy's moving, then we'll tend to use a constraint-based approach where we'll actually set some form of task rather than using an internal or an external cue and get them to perform the task while they're maybe going through that movement, whether it's linear running or change of direction.
Yes, and I suppose will that alter depending on the severity and also like the location of the hamstring injury as well?
Yeah, I think the severity will determine how quickly you can get them back into high-speed running and how readily available they're going to be to start to accelerate through those early phases. We still have the same approach as a grade 1 to a grade 3. It's just how quickly they progress through that is very much individualized, and obviously the higher the severity, typically the more inhibited some of their initial movement patterns will be. Their range of motion and their strength tend to be slightly more restricted. Although I have had some medial column hamstring injuries with a grade 3 who were able to return to higher speed running quicker than what a biceps femoris would be, probably because they're putting slightly less load on the medial column, and you get a little bit more assistance from the adductor magnus and the gluten biceps femoris component. So you are able to run a little bit quicker within the rehab, but then there were certain components of their change of direction and agility that we had to hold back. So I think the important component is that within the criterion-based approach, you can move as quickly through any stage separate to the other stage. So if you can progress quickly through kicking progressions, but your running is stagnated a little bit, that's okay, because at least we're applying another stimulus. And I think for guys who are wanting to get back into skills quickly, it's really valuable to show them that there's a component that they're going through quickly. So if that's strength, but their running is hindered slightly, then show them that they're getting back to their pre-injury strength or they're aligned with the main group strength as early as possible. And if it's skills or change of direction, then accelerate them through that criteria, but don't hold them back just because possibly they haven't got to the running speeds you'd like, whether let's say 18 kilometers per hour in AFL terms for high speed running. If they haven't got to that, but they're able to progress through some of the planned agility or the skills components, then allow them to do that, because those little wins and those successes will actually help them to progress through the other stages of their return to play phases.
And do you think, I suppose this is to both of you as well, like you talked a lot about strength in this. Do you reckon the isometric and eccentric kind of strength is a role to play within there, whether that be monitoring and showing players the progressions depending on the status?
I think, Salman touched on some great points there with the severity of injury, firstly, and location of injury, in that it should inform what we do, but we shouldn't be dictated to by that sort of diagnostic or categorical kind of variable. I think we need to really treat each individual as they present and progress them as quickly as is appropriate for them. And I think progressing each component of rehabilitation on its merits is really important, because some guys will tolerate things like isometric loading really well, really early. Others will actually tolerate eccentric loading a lot earlier than isometric loading. It's probably not what is traditionally thought to be that progression with strength training of we do isometric loading and then we move to conventional concentric, eccentric exercise, and then we implement our eccentric only exercise. And we've got some data from our research study, which is unpublished, that actually shows that guys in our study actually were able to tolerate the eccentric loading much earlier than they were what is typically thought to be more lower level concentric eccentric exercises. So that initiation of the concentric contraction was often the thing that the guys reported as being the most challenging, and they'd report pain most often during that. But in saying that, that's talking about at a group level. Some individuals may be the opposite. So I think that helps with your buy-in a lot, is if an athlete can say, well, look, I'm not doing so well with my long length hip extension exercises through, concentric, eccentric range, for example, but I may be doing okay with my, shorter length knee flexor eccentrics. And they get a bit of a kick out of that. Like, okay, it's good. That's what I'm progressing on, but I know I need to work on this other area. Or it might be the complete opposite, where they're progressing well with their, long length concentric stuff, and they're struggling a bit with something like a Nordic, and that's fine. I think where it falls down is where we go to an approach where we have phase 1, phase 2, and we can't have any fluidity with exercises between those. And that's what you often see, I guess, in protocols that get proposed and put up as sort of recipe type approaches, is that, phase 1 contains exercises A, B, and C. And then we've got exercises D, E, and F in the next stage there. And even if we implement really clear criteria to progress from one to the next, who's to say that me as an injured athlete can't do exercise E and F, even though, I'm struggling with A and B, for example, whereas Selwyn might be the opposite. He's handling, exercise C really well, but, he's not able to do some of those ones in the next phase. So that individualized approach based on what we term exercise specific progression, I think, is quite important. And for us, that's sort of looking at, long length, hip dominant movements, whether it's moderate length, hip extension based, whether it's running, whether it's change of direction, whether it's eccentric exercises, progressing each of those things on its merits and having a criteria that's specific to each of those movements to allow progression, rather than an independent test, which might not necessarily be related. So traditionally it's been things like maybe a range of motion assessment or a clinical assessment of isometric strength. And that's been used as the barometer to say, yes, you should be doing maybe eccentric loading, or no, you shouldn't. Whereas what we find is perhaps a bit more specific, is just saying, how do you cope with the submaximal eccentric? Once you're tolerating that, maybe bilaterally, we then progress them, increase the, unilateral loading, and then increase the intensity of that loading as well. So it tends to be more a specific approach that I think works quite well.
I suppose that leads me on to the next question, really, is like, because you talked about bilateral and unilateral exercises there as well, and like during like the hamstring strain injury rehabilitation, how do you progress them with different injuries, and also what's kind of like your philosophy on bilateral and unilateral to both of you, really?
Yeah, you tend to probably find most guys are able to tolerate the bilateral knee dominant and hip dominant movements earlier on in their rehab, probably because they're able to have maybe some form of deviation in how much load they're actually putting through the injured limb or the injured tissue. So you probably find that, and we've definitely found that they're able to tolerate, for example, the double leg eccentric slide out as early as 1 to 2 days following initial injury, especially in grade 1s and grade 2s. And even with some grade 3 injuries, depending on the athlete, they're still able to perform it. They may just not be able to perform it through the full range. And what I kind of have thought through over the years is, well, is it better that the athlete is able to still be able to perform that even though it's modified range, versus me telling them that they've failed and just changing it because I thought that they couldn't achieve it? And what I've found is the ability to apply that on a daily perspective and actually use the training component within the gym to help select and modify the exercises has allowed the athlete to see how day to day they've been able to regain strength and regain movement efficiency. So we tend to start with the bilateral, but then try and introduce them to some unilateral variations, especially with the tissue specific stuff around what tissue they injured. So if that's a biceps femoris, is it more unilateral hip dominant work that we need to be applying? If it's a medial column semitendinosus, then what unilateral knee dominant movements can we use? And we train everything within a vertical integration approach. So we'll be applying isotonic, eccentric and isometric within the same training sessions. And then what will just happen across the week is I'll vary the intensity, the volume and the load depending on what we need to achieve on the field or in the gym. So for example, if we're running 3 or 4 times a week, we may have possibly one session that is a repeat high speed session. So that's probably not going to be the session that a guy is going to be able to be doing high volumes of eccentrics or high volume of isotonic work. So how I then periodize their strength exposures throughout the week, and it may mean that their heavy eccentric work is at the start of the week away from their repeat speed or their max velocity work, and then following their max velocity work, they may actually do more isometric contraction or some isotonic form within the hip dominant or knee dominant prescription. So you kind of use that tissue that's been injured to help guide your prescription around those hip or knee dominant exercises. And some of the research that Matt Bourne and the team have done around what exercises preferentially target certain tissues has been valuable within that. But then also a lot of that research was done in healthy athletes. So you also have to take into account that do you need to apply greater eccentric stimulus in some of those movements, especially with hip dominant movements, whether that be 45-degree back extensions or single leg Romanian deadlift variations, and using things like landmines. And we've got a Kaiser air runner that allows for hand support. So can you use something like a Kaiser machine to assist in overloading a hip or an eccentric component?
Yeah, I think on that, the laterality of your exercise selection, the hip dominant stuff is often the challenge and often the question you get asked from people about. And I find that the classic example is progressing from someone really early days and they might be doing, bilateral hamstring bridging to get some movement through the hips. Then they're progressing to just doing some bilateral hip hinging. And then people will think, okay, I want to expose the injured leg to load. So we're going to go for a unilateral RDL, for example, as a progression. One thing you've got to keep in mind is what is the adaptation I'm trying to achieve with my exercise? And something like a single leg RDL, particularly in someone who doesn't have lifting experience, is the main limiting factor there is going to be things like balance, being able to manipulate the bar, control trunk position. And so therefore the hamstrings aren't actually getting a very good strength stimulus in that exercise. So it depends on the goal that you're trying to achieve. And that's where something like a GHR or a 45-degree hip extension is really useful, because it actually allows us to control the movement and not have to manipulate a bar in a unilateral activity, for example. So just considering that and thinking, if I'm doing something like an RDL in someone with less lifting experience, when I'm progressing them, I might actually keep them a bit more bilateral and add load and add an external resistance, rather than just keep them unilateral where they might be limited by their technique. So it's a really important consideration, particularly with the hip dominant stuff, I think.
Cool, thank you. And I suppose the end goal ultimately is, as you mentioned, what is the goal? The end goal for everyone is to get these guys back into training, back into playing games. So are there any specific criteria that you guys have to set your guys that they have to achieve before returning back to full training and then returning to full matches?
Yeah, I think you have to have a multifactorial approach in that you need to be able to address multiple components. And so the strength, capacity and resilience will be one component, their ability to withstand training load or training stimulus in a high speed or max velocity component. So for us in our environment, we value hamstring eccentric strength assessment and making sure that their hamstring strength as assessed eccentrically on the Nord board is at least near what their pre-injury status was, or even within 90% of their previous max, just to more so to guide for us to know that they've got a certain amount of tissue resilience to withstand the other components that we're going to place on it. And then we'll also use a hip dominant variation to assess as well. So that might be a Romanian deadlift or a weighted GHR, and look at what their relative strength capacity is based on their body weight and then what their previous load exposure was. We can use some other power profile metrics around jumping and those sorts of things, but the specific stuff around hamstrings of those, and then really looking at their percentage of max velocity that they've been exposed to. And we're really strong on getting guys above 95% as their return to play marker. So they must achieve at least one repetition at that. And we have some guys that may need to achieve multiple depending on what their physical capacity is like. Those guys, those quicker guys and guys that are exposed to close to 10 meters per second, or in our environment, we don't get that quick, but greater than 9 meters per second or 34 to 35 kilometers an hour in AFL, they need to be exposed closer to that, because they're the guys that probably in the game scenario are going to get to those speeds more frequently. So that's a really important factor. And then the accumulation of distance that they get at those speeds and how many efforts they achieve. And that kind of builds into the holistic approach of returning our guys to performance.
So when you talk about achieving greater than 95% of max velocity, how do you go about achieving that? Is that in isolation, like they have to do a 40-meter run, for example, or do you try and incorporate that within the return to play training strategies that you do?
Depends where we are. In pre-season, we would possibly allow them to try and achieve it in training, but in season, when we're trying to basically give a tick of approval for them to go back into full main training and into a game, they'd have to achieve it prior to training in a controlled run through. So we have a run through set up with a 25 to 30 meter build up period, and it's basically a flying 30 where we would allow them to achieve it. Then the other components of the max velocity, distance and efforts, we would then allow them to try and achieve within training. So it's a little bit more game speed related and possibly a bit more curve linear exposure, which they might not run as quickly, but they're probably getting exposure to different muscle activation components from that type of running.
Thanks, Owen. And obviously you get different type of mechanisms that cause the hamstring injuries, and I suppose this is the both of you, because you've got different instances. Like obviously you can get it through running, you can get it through a contact, and then it's a sharp deceleration, and then you have guys that have had previous hamstring injury history as well. Do you change the actual criteria based upon how they actually sustain the injury, or is it just this is the hamstring injury, this is what we do, it's always max velocity, and that's always consistent?
I think it's good to have, some consistent criteria for certain things, and obviously your basic clinical criteria really won't change a lot. But when we're talking about that, that last stage of a criteria-based approach where we're allowing return to sport, then obviously we're going to get more specific just within the sport, but that's where we might consider things like injury mechanism as well, particularly apprehension with those specific movements. And I know from working with predominantly guys playing Australian rules football from all different levels, a fairly common injury mechanism that kind of is slightly different or slightly unique in Aussie rules, maybe a bit consistent in sport like Gaelic football, where at a high speed you're executing a kicking action. And so whether it's not necessarily the kicking leg, but even the stance leg, when you go to plant that at a high speed, you're putting it in a fairly vulnerable position, or the hamstring in a fairly vulnerable position. So making sure that there's no apprehension or fear with those, types of movements, I think is something that you might factor in someone who may have had a mechanism such as that, or if it was more of a hip flexion based mechanism, which might have involved some contact, for example, that's going to be something that needs to be assessed as part of your return to play battery. So, doing things like ground ball pickups and at speed, changing direction. I suppose where it gets challenging is occasionally you'll get thrown one where a guy will injure their hamstring from what seems like a completely innocuous or random incident where they do something and you almost wonder how there was any load that went through the hamstrings at all. So they obviously throw a bit of a spanner in the works. But I think there's an element of an individualized criteria, but we need to be careful in that there's not really a precedent or any data to suggest whether that needs to be passed or not before going back. And even with what we think are relatively well-established return to play criteria, we really don't have a lot of good quality data to suggest whether passing or failing certain tests increases or decreases our risk of re-injury, or probably more importantly indicates whether we're going to perform well or not. And I think obviously in Selwyn's environment, that's most pertinent is making sure someone's not just ready to play, but they're ready to perform. And I think as an industry generally, we're getting a lot better at understanding the difference between return to play criteria and return to performance criteria and the definitions around that. And that's something that I think has improved a lot in the hamstring injury space, especially.
Because I suppose we're really good at assessing controlled environments, like Selwyn said with the max velocity, and like what you just said, Jack. Actually, those kind of like kicking and those pickups to then kick. It's difficult to really measure in that as well. And I suppose like that's maybe why we haven't put them as RTPs. Do you think is because there's not been anything to objectively quantify them?
Yeah, we're obviously, as tests, we're going to gravitate towards those ones that are very controlled, they're repeatable, they're reliable. So we know what we're measuring is what we're measuring. Whereas, coming up with a valid and reliable test of someone's specific injury mechanism, it's not going to exist. So that's where that art meets science, I think, and understanding that, you're going to be guided by some very very controlled movements, some controlled tests, particularly earlier on. But as we progress through it, there's a few unknowns, and I think that's what separates us from being able to do just a good basic job, which, to be honest, most of the time it might get us the results we want anyway. But if we want to be really thorough, then we want to probably consider those other things as well, and try to at least assess, again, things like pain and apprehension. That's probably the best you can do with some of those more unique movements.
Yeah, I think you with the assessing the movement capability component of the mechanism, you're trying to drip feed that in controlled environments initially, and then add chaos to it. So while you probably can't put a strict guideline around what that looks like from the mechanism perspective, as long as you add it in throughout the process. And what we try and do is, if a guy did it when he accepted a ground ball and maybe got pushed in the back at the same time, we may drip feed ground balls in controlled environments in stage 1. So that they're just relearning that pattern and not creating fear about getting back into it. And then that's where integrating the skill coaches and having that collaborative approach to say, all right, well, we know that this is how he got injured. Was there a component that you believe as a skill coach that was technical at all? And do we need to address that throughout the rehab phase? Or was it just a bad luck scenario? So we need to expose them to that in the later stages of their reconditioning phases to make sure that once they're back in the team training scenario, if they're placed in that again, they're going to be able to perform it, execute it, and succeed.
Cheers, guys. Thank you very much for that. Just on the last point, is if anyone's got any more questions, even though you've answered a lot of the questions very thoroughly and in a lot of detail, do you guys have like any platforms that you prefer people to contact you on to get in touch and ask more questions? Over to you, Jack, first.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. Probably don't use it prevalently, but it's probably a good way to get in touch. So my Twitter handle is just my name, Jack Hickey 89. At least that's what I remember it being. But email, more than happy for people to fire me an email as well. So it's just my name, jack.hickey@acu.edu.au. So either Twitter or email, more than happy to answer any questions or share ideas, because I think we can always learn from questions that people ask, or they've often got some really valuable input. So more than happy to chat.
Cheers. And for you, Selwyn?
Yeah, just Twitter handle @SelwynOsteo, and can send me an email at it's just athletic approach, one word, @outlook.com.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys.